It's been a while, but I'm finally back to making analysis videos again. For this video, I'll be talking about Code Lyoko and its issue with sequels. Now, to start, I'll give a brief overview of the show for those who may be new to it. Code Lyoko is a show originally released in France on September 3rd, 2003 by Moonscoop that revolved around a group of teenagers, Jeremy, Odd, Yumi, and Ulrich, as they entered a virtual world called Lyoko in order to try and help Aelita, a girl trapped in this virtual world, and to stop a rogue AI named Xana. The show was very unique in how it was animated, with the parts taking place in the real world done in 2D and the parts on Lyoko in 3D. Now, the animation was a bit rough around the edges at times, especially early on, but the story and characters kept the show interesting and engaging. It was brought over to the US and dubbed in English on April 19, 2004, and gained a dedicated following that's still alive to this day. The show ran for 97 episodes and ended on November 10, 2007 in France, and the final episodes of the English dub being released online sometime around after November 17th, 2007. There's no real specific date. I imagine they were all just kind of released on one day, you know? Now, the reason why the show ended when it did was because the broadcasters didn't have any desire for a fifth season, so the writers chose to give the show a proper ending, in the words of Sophie de Croizet, the writing director for seasons 1 through 3 and a scriptwriter for the whole show. However, many fans felt that there were too many questions left unanswered after the finale, and thus wanted to see a sequel to the show. And we got it in the form of a book series called Code Lyoko Chronicles. Chronicles was ghost-written by David Morosinoto and Pierdomenico Bacalario under the pen name Jeremy Belpois, and were originally written in Italian. I gotta tell you, it was quite a journey to try and figure out the authors, because there was actually quite a lot of debate several years ago about it, but it turns out, at least in an interview with Morosinoto, he says that they worked on it together, so people were arguing if it was one or the other, but it turns out apparently it was both. The first book was released on May 11th, 2009, and consisted of 3 other books, the last of which was released in November of 2010. Now, many of you watching this may never have heard of Chronicles before, and there's a good reason for that. While all 4 books were translated to be sold in Spain, only the first 2 books ever received an official French translation, supposedly due to poor sales, according to the Code Lyoko fan site. As a result, the books never got translated to English and published in countries like the US, and because of it, they faded into obscurity. Fortunately, fans of the show came together to do fan translations of the last 2 books into French, and all of them into English. All the books in all 4 languages have since been available to be downloaded and read for free from a Code Lyoko fan site, codelyoko.fr. A link to them is in the description. In these books, all of the lingering plot threads are resolved and the story is given a solid conclusion. And because of this, I highly recommend any fan of the show to go read them right now, if they haven't already. However, as many fans are aware, there is another sequel to the series. One that took Chronicles' place as the official canon sequel, called Code Lyoko Evolution. Evolution is also set as a direct follow-up to the original show, only this time the real-world sections were done in live action with different actors than the original voice cast. The show first aired on December 19th, 2012, with the last episode airing exactly 1 year later. This show has received a lot of backlash from the fanbase, as they criticize the transition to live action, the acting being poor, inconsistencies with the original show, among other things. And to top it all off, it ends in a way that doesn't really resolve the plot, leaving many questions still unanswered. And this is where the issues truly lie. Evolution leaves things unresolved, and fans that didn't know about Chronicles felt dissatisfied with not having any official answers to their major questions. And while Chronicles does provide a much better resolution, it isn't even really canon anymore, so even if it is better, it doesn't change that Evolution does supersede it at the end of the day. While I can't speak for the rest of the fandom, I can say that this did bother me quite a bit, so I set out to try and find a way to make peace with all of this. Now, from here on out, there are going to be major spoilers for Code Lyoko, Chronicles, and Evolution. So if you want to experience these stories blind, you should stop watching this video and go do that now. And if you value my opinion, I would say definitely go do that. You'll hear my opinions on Evolution, but I can't stop you. If you want to see it and you want to see it blind, then go do that. But I would definitely recommend at least the show and the books. The entire show, both the original and Evolution, are available for free on Code Lyoko's official YouTube channels, and the link to Chronicles is down below, as I stated earlier. With all of that out of the way, let's start off by answering the first major question. Did Code Lyoko even need a sequel in the first place? Now, the original show had a mostly episodic nature, and as a result, there weren't many plot revelations or developments throughout the show. However, when Season 2 came along, we were finally given some answers about who Waldo Schaefer, the creator of the supercomputer, was, why Xana was created, and what Project Carthage was. However, the answers we got weren't much. In episode 49 titled Franz Hopper, a man claiming to be Franz, which is Waldo Schaefer's alias in the show, explains that Xana was a multi-agent system used to combat a military project, but it was later revealed that it was Xana impersonating him, so this information was called into question until it was later reinforced and expanded on in episode 52, The Key. In this episode, we learn that Project Carthage was a military program designed to block enemy communications, that Lyoko was created as a safe haven for him and his daughter, and that Xana was indeed created to destroy Carthage, confirming what Xana had told them before, and that Aelita is his daughter. While this is a nice start to answering some major questions, it leaves several things unexplained. What was so dangerous about Project Carthage that it required Schaefer to create Xana to destroy it? Why did Xana go rogue and turn on Schaefer? Did he even succeed in stopping Project Carthage? Why does Xana want to wipe out humanity? At first, it was okay that these questions weren't answered fully, since there were still 2 seasons left, and the show had only barely gone past the halfway point. Surely we would get these answers eventually. Unfortunately, we didn't. Aside from episode 52, Project Carthage isn't even really mentioned ever again, aside from someone maybe saying the name once or twice. But even then, it was never a substantial thing, revealing something about them. 97 episodes, and all we got was 35 seconds in episode 49 and 1 minute and 30 seconds in episode 52. That also restated what we learned in 49 to explain the deeper lore of the show. To make it worse, Aelita's mother, Anthea, was revealed in a flashback during episode 82, Distant Memory, to not have died, but instead to have been kidnapped by the Men in Black. This revelation would naturally make you think that the writers were going to do something with Anthea's character, but they do nothing, and her fate is left ambiguous. We also see a wolf that has haunted her memories in the past, but that's never really explained either. It could be related to the Men in Black, or it could literally just be a wild wolf that she associates with her trauma. There's no deeper reasoning given to it. We just have to assume everything about the wolf, what it's supposed to represent. Now, it isn't necessary for a story to explain every aspect of itself to be satisfying. Sometimes over-explaining can ruin the magic of a story by trying to explain things that don't actually matter. At the end of the day, the main goal of Code Lyoko was to first get Aelita off Lyoko and stop Xana. While they succeeded at the former, the latter proved much more difficult. But ultimately, they achieved that goal. So from that perspective, the story is done. It doesn't really matter what Carthage was doing or where Anthea might be, because the story was about stopping Xana, first and foremost. The main problem I have with that line of thinking, however, is that the entire reason the main plot device of Lyoko and the main antagonist Xana even exist is because of Carthage. Nothing would have happened if not for whatever Carthage was doing. And to top it off, we never even know if Schaefer succeeded in stopping them. At the end of the series, he dies while protecting Aelita so that our heroes can kill his creation. And yet we have no idea if he even managed to stop the project that indirectly led to his death. After all, no Carthage, no Lyoko, no Xana, and therefore, no dead Hopper. And since Anthea was the wife of a man associated with Carthage and is likely still with the Men in Black, a government agency, Learning more about Project Carthage would likely yield answers regarding her whereabouts and could tie up that storyline. While the former writing directors may feel like the show had a proper conclusion, it's easy to see why many fans disagree with them on this. What makes the situation rather confusing, though, is that from the statement from Sophie that I showed earlier, they knew ahead of time that this would be the final season. Add in the fact that it was the longest season in the show by 4 episodes, and it's pretty clear to me that the reason these questions weren't answered wasn't because the writers didn't have enough time or forewarning that this was the end, but because they felt it wasn't necessary to tell that part of the story. I could be wrong about that, but given the information, if they knew before production on season 4 began, surely they would have had enough time to include the stories that they felt were necessary. And the fact that these weren't, to me, says that they didn't think it was necessary to tell us this information. I tried to contact her along with several of the creators of the show, Evolution and even Chronicles, to answer some of my questions for why they had made the decisions they did, but I couldn't find ways to contact everyone, and for the ones I found, I never got responses from them. However, in an attempt to gain more perspectives on the series, I created a poll for the fans to put their thoughts and opinions. In regards to the ending, opinions were mixed. While some felt the ending was satisfying despite leaving things unanswered that they wanted to know, others felt like the unresolved plotlines left the ending feeling very unsatisfying, with one person even going so far as to say that Season 4 was the worst season of the show. I also asked about questions that they wanted answered and that they believed needed to be answered for the sake of the story. And most of them were the questions I already mentioned. But there were a few unique ones, such as, what about any friends that Alita had before going to Lyoko? Did they mourn her loss or report her disappearance? Admittedly, I had actually never thought of that before, and I was like, that's actually quite an interesting point. Like, surely she had some friends, and her disappearing would affect them, and then if they ever ran into her, that would cause some confusion. I also polled them on if they believed the show needed a sequel, to which all but one said yes, with one saying that they would be fine with a sequel so long as it's faithful. I was only able to poll 13 people, so I know this isn't a completely accurate representation of how the fandom feels as a whole, but at least it's something. So, now that we've established the reasons for why the fans believe a sequel was needed, we need to figure out something else. What does a sequel to Code Lyoko need in order to be good? Now, when I say this, I don't mean what questions need to be answered. Like, obviously, the sequel should address the questions that were previously mentioned. What I mean when I ask that is, what made Code Lyoko so enjoyable to us? So that we all understand what a sequel needs to replicate to be an entertaining and faithful continuation of the show. In the show, there were a few things consistent about it. The animation started out really rough at the start, and while it did improve, it was never really groundbreaking. The fight choreography, with the exception of most of the fights from Season 2, was incredibly simple and not overly impressive. The voice acting, though it did improve, could be really bad at times, with line deliveries that felt unnatural and emotionless.
To explain it all would take me hours, and I'm not sure you're ready to put up with me for that long, right? To end my report, I'd like to show you something that's been in my family for centuries.
And the story, while interesting and engaging, rarely played a major part in the show as it mostly focused on episodic adventures. But despite all of that, we still loved this show, and the reason why was because of the aspects of the show that were consistent throughout. The dialogue was witty and entertaining, and the characters were lovable and fun to watch as they tried to deal with both their normal lives and Xana's attacks. Seeing what crazy things Xana would do next was always so fun and exciting, and the music helped to set the tone and ambiance for the show no matter what emotion it was trying to convey.
Wow, this place is weird. Triangulate!
And while I did criticize the voice acting earlier, even in the beginning, the actors would still have very passionate and emotional deliveries at times that helped to bring these characters to life.
Jeremy, it's impossible. The virus is still in me. I can feel it.
We've still got to try it. Maybe you can be treated here on Earth.
No, Jeremy. You know that as well as I do. As long as this virus is inside of me, you can't destroy Xana without destroying me at the same time.
We could materialize you for an hour or two, so you could pay us a little visit, huh?
Why not? But the rest of the time, I'll have to stay here on Lyoko to fight Xana until the day you find an antivirus.
Aelita,
And that to me is the heart of what makes Code Lyoko great, the characters. If I didn't care about them, I wouldn't have watched the show because I would be apathetic to their struggles, since I wouldn't have any emotional attachment to them. Even when other aspects of the show fell short, the characters would always be really fun and engaging to watch. Even if a sequel has great music, great writing, professional level acting, and a more consistent plot, with some of the greatest animation in the world, if the characters aren't well written and are boring to watch, none of these things will be able to save it because at that point, it isn't really Code Lyoko anymore. Of course, a heart alone does not make up an entire body, nor a foundation an entire house. Stories are very complex, so even if you manage to nail the characters, it doesn't guarantee that the sequel will be successful. Alright, now that I've gone over what, in my opinion, is the most important aspects of the show that made it successful, let's analyze the two sequels to see how they hold up. To start, I'll be going over Evolution first, because despite coming out after Chronicles, it is more well known, and I want to save Chronicles for last since I feel it serves as a better conclusion to this analysis. First, I want to go over more superficial stuff before diving into the story and characters themselves. Immediately, the differences are pretty obvious with Evolution. The 2D animation for the real world has been replaced with live action, with new actors playing familiar characters. While some of the actors look close enough to their animated counterparts, Odd's actor Gulliver Bevernage Benhaj? I apologize for that pronunciation. Looks a little too young, especially when compared to the rest of the cast. Other characters like Mr. Delmas and Mrs. Hertz look significantly younger. Sam is white instead of black, and Sissy now has blonde hair. Although that last one is likely a reference to a line by Odd in the last episode of the original show.
I'm not as stupid as you think. What are you doing here?
Nothing at all. Hey, you would look really great as a blonde. Suits your personality. Bye now!
Now, the main reason why live-action adaptations of animated media have actors that look different from the originals is usually due to the actors simply being the best for the role, or because they couldn't find someone who fit the character's physical appearance. So aside from Sam being a completely different ethnicity, it's hard to hold that against them, for characters like Odd and the rest. Although, while I appreciate the fact that they tried to make Aelita look like she did from the cartoon, the pink wig really stands out and it can be distracting at times. Moving on over to the Lyoko side of the show, there are even more physical differences. The towers are now black rectangular prisons with parts that jut out here and there. The art style is a little different, mainly with the characters' designs, and all of the Lyoko warriors have new outfits. While changing things in this world isn't inherently bad, the problem is that there's little to no explanation for these changes. And because characters rarely even address these differences either, the only explanation that can make sense is that the writers for this series retconned it to where things have always been this way. Odd doesn't question the fact that his weapons got upgraded, nor does anyone even make a remark about the fact that their appearance on Lyoko has changed, that the towers look different, or that the monsters aren't all acting the way they should. That's right, even Xana's monsters are inconsistent from the original. But before I get into that, let's talk about the main antagonist himself, since it directly relates to my issues with the monsters. So, Xana managed to survive by hiding a piece of itself in a supercomputer our heroes call the Cortex, and during his supposed death at the end of Season 4, he stored some of his source code into Ulrich, Yumi, Odd, and Aelita. In a weakened state, Xana sends specters to steal back his codes to regain his strength and to take over the world. While an interesting idea in theory, in execution, it's one of the most disappointing aspects of this show. For you see, sending specters is basically all Xana ever does in this show. There are no unique attacks like possessing samurai armor or reversing gravity. It's just always specters, and unintimidating ones at that. More often than not, they'll just walk towards the heroes instead of running to catch them. And whenever they gain an opportunity to try and steal some code, they usually just stand there and only start to move once the tower is being deactivated. Now, there is a narrative reason to explain some of this. Since Xana needs his codes, he can't do something that could kill them, so he has to send specters, and since he's weaker, they can't do nearly as much at the start. However, just because the story justifies it doesn't change the fact that it's boring and repetitive to see a specter attack over and over again in almost every single episode. As the show goes on, Xana does regain some of his power, and the specters do gain some new abilities like shooting lasers, but they still never had the presence that they used to. Now, Season 3, and especially Season 4, also suffered from the same issue. In Season 3, Xana needed Aelita to delete sectors, and in Season 4, he needed to throw her into the digital sea to draw Waldo Schaefer. Because of this, his attacks in those seasons are almost always consisted of simply possessing one of or many people over and over again to kidnap Aelita and bring her to Lyoko. The main difference between the two is that Xana still tries to kill the ones he doesn't need, like Ulrich or Odd, at the same time, while in Evolution, even after stealing all of someone's code, he doesn't kill them. But even then, it was still repetitive and disappointing. A plausible reason for the directors repeating this mistake is due to the fact that, contrary to popular belief, they did in fact watch the show. In an interview with the directors Florian Ferrier and Lucio de Rosa, they had mainly watched the episodes of Season 4, though they did still watch every episode. This fixation on Season 4 is most likely why the plot structure of Evolution is so similar, and why it shares many of the same problems in regards to Xana's attacks. Okay, so now that Xana's whole situation has been explained, I can properly discuss my issues with the monsters. From the get-go, we see an issue with the Mega Tanks, as they don't retract their eyes of Xana on the side when rolling, and their lasers are different as they no longer are a continuous laser wall, but a detached beam. Aside from just being inconsistent with the original canon, there are some practical issues with this as well. Now that their attacks are separate, the Lyoko warriors can just dodge out of the way and then immediately get back in front again to take a shot at its weak point, whereas before the point was basically completely protected as long as their attack was still out. Another victim of the show is the block. Oh boy. They used to be invulnerable on every part of their body aside from the Eye of Xana, the weak point of every monster, but now they can be killed by hitting them anywhere. And from this scene here, it looks like Odd kills a block by touching its eye with his tail? You could use the whole Xana is weaker explanation to try and explain it, but the other monsters prove that isn't the case. The crabs, for instance, are stronger than they've ever been, as their shells are mostly impenetrable. One of them even lowered its head to block Aelita's energy field, despite the fact that it puts its original weak point closer to the attack. Most of the time, they have to hit them in between the shells to kill them, meaning that they're stronger than ever despite Xana being weaker. However, they still kill crabs through the original methods sometimes, so the show isn't even consistent with its new canon. Cankerlots also no longer have to charge up to attack, which further disproves the weaker Xana explanation. And the worst change by far was made to the tarantulas. These monsters used to be really cool for a few reasons, but the most obvious one can be described in 2 words. Gun legs. It was such an interesting idea that really made them stand out. But in Evolution, they shoot through their eye. I was so pissed every time I saw it, because they made the tarantulas infinitely less cool with no plausible explanation. They still have their gun legs rendered, so all they would need to do is animate the tarantulas sitting in firing positions and add the laser effect to the ends of the feet. And to top it all off, despite being less cool, it does make them more effective. In the original show, they would sometimes stand on their hind legs and shoot while chasing someone, but it couldn't stand for long and it would quickly go back to just chasing again. Now that they shoot from their eyes, they can still rapid-fire lasers while chasing an enemy, meaning that, once again, despite Xana being weaker, his monsters are somehow more efficient than ever. And we're still not done, because, on top of all that, they even took away the unique laser sound effects and animations for each monster from the original, and replaced them with the same visual effect, aside from the Mega Tanks, of course, and the same sound effect. Not only that, none of them even use additional attacks, if they had one in the original. No homing mines for the mantas, no ice beam or fire rings for the blocks, no underside laser pillar for the crabs, nope! It's all just generic lasers now. All of these changes have stripped these monsters of much of their uniqueness and cool factor, as well as their specialization for different tasks. The tarantula's ineffectiveness to chase and shoot made them better at being sentries that defend a point. Cankerlots were small and took a while to fire, making them better for scouting. Blocks were durable tanks that with a wide variety of attacks, and so on and so forth. I can understand wanting to get rid of weaknesses to show both improvement and to increase Xana as a threat, but in doing so, they turned almost all the monsters into exact replicas of each other, just with different looking models. They look different, but they function in almost the exact same way. The only thing that I could praise about the monsters in this series is the way the mantas fly felt very intimidating and fast. So whoever did the flight animations for the mantas, good job. You did something good, and I appreciate it. But everything else, it's just so irritating and disappointing. But enough about Xana, how about our heroes? Well, aside from Yumi not having telekinesis and having a bow staff with no explanation for where it came from, Ulrich never using Triangulate, Alita never using her creation ability as far as I can remember, and having more powerful shields, Odd's aforementioned weapon upgrade, and William never using his ranged sword beam, they're basically the same. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's in context of everything, it's not the biggest change ever. It's just more they seemed they just didn't want to give them too much to play with. But then they give people new stuff. I don't understand the reasoning for a lot of this. They still have their strengths and weaknesses that set them apart. The fight choreography, however, hasn't really improved much from the standard quality of fights from the original show, and they never managed to match the quality of the fights in Season 2. While the animation overall is a step up, with the cleaner models and smoother movement animations, although they are a little stilted sometimes, mostly at the beginning, the fights still mostly consist of very basic maneuvers. It doesn't repeat the 3D animation nearly as much as the original, but if that was what was needed for more interesting and engaging fights, I'd gladly take it. And even when they do something impressive and cool, it's often ruined by the really bad slow motion effect. They use it obsessively at the start of the show, but they use it less frequently as the show progresses. Also, while the death animation is nice, I do miss the old ones. There was something satisfying about seeing a part of the monster blowing up and leaving part of its body behind before disappearing. I don't know what it is, but there's just something about it. And while it isn't a retcon, the forest and ice sectors are lost without any proper explanation. Jeremy guesses that some data was lost when they shut it down, but that just doesn't make a lick of sense. And besides, we know Jeremy can recreate the sectors, so why can't he do it again?
Thanks to the data we got from my father before he disappeared into the network, Jeremy and I have just about recreated Lyoko.
You're recreating Lyoko?
We may even be ready by tonight.
That's right. In fact, Alita and I have worked on it every night for the last week.
According to the same interview from before, they said that they chose to limit the number of sectors to better exploit the remaining ones, but it's unclear what they mean by that. I don't remember them doing anything unique with them, so all they really succeeded in doing was making Lyoko, and by extension the show, feel less diverse and more repetitive due to the smaller number of locations that they could use. So more than likely, they didn't say it was for money, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't due to a monetary or time constraint that they didn't create these other sectors. Now, while I have been very harsh thus far, things like where the monsters shoot from, while inconsistent from the lore and being damaging to their uniqueness, ultimately don't have much bearing on the story. If they animated them like they did before, the story would still progress the same. So, even if these minor things upset me, they can still redeem themselves by writing an engaging story with great dialogue and answers to the questions I've long since wanted answers to. Unfortunately, that isn't what we get. Now, to be fair, I actually think the concept of the story is very interesting. A new supercomputer run by a man named Tyron that used to work with Schaefer on Project Carthage is a good way to expand the lore and start answering long-standing questions that fans have had. It's just a shame that it was executed so poorly. As I said before getting into discussing Evolution, the heart of the series that made me, and I imagine most of the rest of the fanbase, fall in love with the show in the first place was the characters. If we don't care about them, we most likely won't care about the story. Most of the characters in this show were either poorly written, poorly acted, poorly directed, or a combination of the three, with very few exceptions. Aelita in particular suffered the most, as she lost almost all of her compassion and became sassy and cold almost 24/7.
Ouais, le supercalculateur, les Lyoko guerriers, c'est fini tout ça.
Xana est peut-être vivant et ça vous fait marrer? À l'époque, vous auriez eu le quart d'un doute, vous auriez foncé. De toute façon, dans quelques instants, t'auras tout oublié.
Et pour finir, j'ai vu le signe de Xana dans ses yeux. Je sais pas ce qu'il te fait de plus.
Tu mens. C'est ma mère, j'en suis sûre. Si c'était un spectre, elle m'aurait poursuivi quand tu m'as traîné dehors.
Evita!
Tout est de ta faute, je te déteste.
C'était pas ta mère, Elita.
And while the rest of the main cast didn't suffer from nearly as severe of a restructuring to their characters, most of them gave awful performances for nearly every line. It felt like they were only capable of expressing one emotion most of the time.
Bon, faut que j'aille bosser sur le virus. Laura m'attend. Faut vraiment que tu sois prudente. On sait toujours pas qui est le spectre. Méfie-toi de tout le monde.
Salut. Hey.
Salut.
Oula, ça va pas, toi. Laisse-moi deviner. T'as oublié une virgule, un exercice.
Ouais, c'est presque ça. Einstein a trouvé son maître.
C'est qui? Laura Gauthier, la nouvelle sur deux qui a rejoint notre classe. Bon, on peut parler d'autre chose, non? Du contexte, par exemple.
T'as du nouveau?
Ouais, j'ai récupéré pas mal de données la dernière fois. Vous vous souvenez que les répliquants ont été créés par Xana sous le modèle de Lyoko?
Et t'avais pas plus compliqué comme nom?
Pourquoi, tu trouves ça trop facile à retenir?
T'avais dit que ton mégapod machin s'adaptait automatiquement à tous les mouvements de terrain.
Méga véhicule multipode. Et oui, il s'adapte, mais il faut quand même anticiper un minimum.
On peut changer de chauffeur si vous voulez.
Ça va, Odd. Si tu crois que c'est facile, tu te trompes.
Because of this, even when the characters were actually written well and given dialogue that totally matches their character, their flat deliveries often ruined them every time. The only one of the main cast who had moments of decent acting was Melanie Tran, the actress for Yumi, and there's a very clear reason why. Looking at IMDb, Melanie had the most acting experience before working on Evolution, with the only other ones who with any experience at all being Quentin Merbe, who played Ulrich, and Diego Mestanza, who played William. Now, IMDb isn't necessarily like a truly comprehensive list of everything that someone's done. There can be gaps, but from what I understand, like this is all I know about them, and so I don't really have anything else to go off of. Maybe someone out there knows more about their previous careers and like, oh, actually, these other actors did some stuff before Evolution, but even if they did, I imagine it wasn't too much work because they were pretty young when they started the show, so, you know, I doubt they would have had many opportunities to do a lot of work. Most of the adult actors, such as Frank Beckman and Eric Sobolet, who played Tyron and Mr. Dumas respectively, had a lot of prior acting experience and do a great job with the little screen time they have.
Voici le médaillon de ta mère. Elle m'a chargé de te le donner. Maintenant qu'on est entre nous, on va pouvoir parler clairement. Si tu veux revoir ta mère, tu m'obéis. C'est clair? Je sais que vous êtes à deux doigts de viruser mon système. Je veux que tu appelles tes amis et que tu leur dises de tout arrêter.
Non.
Si tu ne m'obéis pas, je ferai en sorte que tu ne revoies jamais ta mère. Mais si tu m'obéis, tu pourras lui dire tout ce que tu veux et même repartir avec elle. Ça m'est égal. J'ai obtenu ce que je voulais d'elle, les archives de ton père. Alors?
Je peux pas faire ça.
Viruser un ordinateur est plus important pour toi que revoir ta mère? Mais arrêtez-les!
Ah, je vous assure, monsieur Gauthier, que cette situation est vraiment temporaire.
Vous venez de m'avouer vous-même que vous étiez absolument incapable de comprendre ce qui était à l'origine de ce désastre. Vous comprendrez que je finisse par me dire que ma fille n'a pas sa place ici. Voilà.
Mais votre fille réussit très bien chez nous, hein. Elle est vraiment très bien intégrée. Et elle semble vraiment très heureuse. C'est un miracle. C'est un miracle.
But since the show isn't about them, their performances aren't enough to save it. I would like to clarify that the quality of the acting isn't entirely the actor's fault. There are many examples of good actors who have given terrible performances due to the directors not doing a good enough job. But since most of them were young and incredibly inexperienced, I imagine the blame can be shared between the two. I have heard that some of them have done much better acting in the years following Evolution, so at least this didn't ruin their careers. Which is it's like the one positive from all of this, I suppose. Now, I want to talk about William for a bit. In the original show, he was honestly little more than a plot device. He only ever caused problems for our protagonists. He was first introduced to cause tension in Ulrich and Yumi's relationship by almost always being around her and also trying to win her heart as well. And that's basically all he did in Season 2 and most of Season 3. There was one time during the zombie episode where he took initiative as the eldest person to do what he thought was best to protect the students by keeping them locked in the cafeteria, but in doing so, he made it hard for Aelita, Odd, and Jeremy to leave and stop Xana. So once again, it was really only done for the sake of conflict and not really to expand his character. If it was definitely more secondary than primary. He also tried setting Ulrich straight by calling him out on his BS at one point, and saved him from drowning, as well as that time that he helped Yumi sneak out to stop Xana despite not knowing what she was up to. But those were outliers amongst the numerous times where he was nothing more than a lover boy whose only real motivation was dating Yumi. Heck, even she calls him out on it at one point.
Christopher Mbala. Hey, last night you pulled a fast one on me. No one has ever humiliated me like that before. What'd you do it for?
Because I find your dumb tube at Casanova act sickening.
But
In the beginning, it was pretty nice, but now I'm really fed up. So why don't you buzz off, William, and leave me alone?
Now, of course, I didn't forget that he wanted to help fight Xana once he did learn about him, both to help save the world and also because he thought it would be fun, which does add a little more to his character and personality. However, in his very first mission, he gets possessed by Xana, destroys Lyoko, and becomes a tool for Xana to cause even more conflict for our heroes, as they now have to deal with William increasing Xana's fighting power, and also trying to save him on top of killing Xana. And when they finally do save him, the next episode, he gets possessed again to cause even more conflict. William was never included to add variety to the team dynamic or to even really be a full-fledged character. And while it may seem like I'm being harsh, the interview with Sophie de Croisette I mentioned near the beginning confirms it. According to her, when they had first introduced him in Season 2, they had already planned for him to be possessed by Xana and that he was introduced in order to disturb things in the group. She even stated that he needed to stay someone that caused problems for the show when asked about what they would have done with him if they had been given another season. So when he was actually given something else to do in Evolution that wasn't just to cause problems, I was all for it. They still needed to deal with the trust issues that naturally would come with trying to work with a former enemy, even if he was possessed. But sometime after episode 6, the whole trust issue thing only really comes up a handful of times. While this is an improvement over the original show, Evolution doesn't really do much else to further his character. He's a good guy now that isn't solely obsessed with Yumi, but I didn't feel like his character really developed beyond that, so there was still untapped potential there. And now to address the elephant in the room, Laura Gauthier. Laura is a new character that was introduced who, just like William and Code Lyoko, was only really meant to cause conflict. She is widely despised by the fanbase, and I mean this in both a good and bad way. From her first episode, she's shown to be self-centered and condescending, as she is incredibly smart and loves when other people know it. She usually prioritizes her own goals and ambitions over things like the secrecy of Lyoko, and is also incredibly nosy. And I love this aspect of her, because it makes moments when she gets her comeuppance incredibly satisfying.
C'est ton père qui a créé Lyoko, c'est ça? De quel droit tu te permets de fouiller dans la vie des gens et de raconter n'importe quoi? Franz Hopper, un informaticien de génie, qui devient prof de sciences dans un lycée et qui cache, comme par hasard, un super calculateur quantique. C'est pas très difficile à comprendre, non? Mais pourquoi il a disparu du jour au lendemain? Ne dis pas qu'il a préféré ses recherches à sa petite Fifi. T'as abandonné? Mon père m'a pas abandonné, il s'est sacrifié pour moi. Et toi? Tu crois que ton petit papa serait capable de sacrifier pour toi?
And it's clear that it's exactly what they were going for. So in that way, it's good that she received so much hate because it was intended. They did a good job writing her that way. However, the aspect of her that everyone hates for negative reasons is that she's a Mary Sue who is far too good at something that she has no experience with. See, in the episode she's introduced, Jeremy is having problems with the supercomputer and doesn't know what to do. Laura, having followed him to the factory without him realizing, shows up and he decides to let her help. They do a return to the past to erase her memories, but due to her help previously, Jeremy asks her for help with a virus that he was testing on Lyoko's core in a later episode. Once she is done helping, they do another return to the past, but this time, it doesn't erase her memories. While working on the virus with Jeremy right next to her, she not only was able to learn about the return to the past without him noticing, but also manages to somehow input her genetic signature or something into the program so that her consciousness would be sent back in time just like the rest. And to top it off, she apparently did it so well that Jeremy, someone who's worked with Lyoko, the supercomputer, and its systems for over 2 years now, is unable to undo something she did in what is at most a few hours despite having literally no prior experience with said computer and systems. This is bullshit. The show may make her out to be roughly as smart as Jeremy, and she may have had received some help understanding the system from him as they worked, but it shouldn't be possible for her to completely and expertly outclass our little Einstein with something she shouldn't be able to fully understand. Even Jeremy had to grow and improve in order to do some things that he did in the original show, and he also failed a lot. The Marabunta is a pretty damn good example of that. What makes this worse is that it breaks a pre-established rule of the show. That being, a person must be scanned in order to have their consciousness sent back in time. So for Laura to completely circumvent this requirement and input a way for the computer to identify her and send her back as well, which again, not even Jeremy can do, is also impossible according to both the lore and basic logic. After this, they decide to make her a part of the team since they can't make her forget, but they only agree to bring her when they need her, which is a few times. Although, the fact that she would be able to help solve a problem that Jeremy and Lita can't solve is also ridiculous. Not just because of the previously mentioned reasons, but also because in the original show, their knowledge and experience combined was always enough to solve any problem they faced. And it made sense, because for one, Jeremy had at least had some experience with the computer up until that point as things got more difficult, and Aelita at first was believed to be a computer program and thus would be very smart. But even after they revealed that she was just a human, she still spent several years in the computer and also was the daughter to the man who made it in the first place, so it made sense that their combined knowledge alone would always be enough to solve the problem. And after the writers had the audacity to insinuate that this was plausible and realistic for this show, later on, Laura goes behind the team's back with William, who is given the flimsiest reason in the world to help her to destroy the Cortex and Xana along with it.
Tiens, c'est du Baudelaire, je suis sûr que tu vas adorer.
C'est super gentil, hein, mais j'ai contrôle de maths demain, je dois encore réviser, et il y a le cross tout à l'heure, donc j'ai vraiment pas le temps. On se retrouve là-bas?
Faut une belle équipe, non? Soudée, solidaire. Je suis toujours d'accord pour te mettre à l'écart. Oh, j'ai contrôle de maths. Alors ta poésie, non merci. Admets-le, William. Toi et moi, on peut faire équipe. Une vraie équipe.
The reason why this is an issue is that they recently learned that Anthea was actually with Tyron, and so the computer was the only way to find her. They had agreed to not destroy the computer until Xana had reached 95% completion, so doing this basically was completely taking away Aelita's ability to find her mother, which was quite a dick move. She's able to get him there just fine, but when it comes to the time to virtualize the Megapod, their new vehicle in this show, she's somehow incapable of doing so. The idea that this character, who we're supposed to believe is just as, if not smarter than Jeremy, is incapable of virtualizing a vehicle, and that she wouldn't make sure that she knows how to beforehand, is so ridiculous and inconsistent with her character that it's honestly hard for me to take any of it seriously. I just feel like I'm constantly being lied to by the writers. And the cherry on top of this inconsistent cake is that Jeremy finally found a solution to what Laura did. He found a way to increase the space-time curvature of the supercomputer, whatever that means, so that it will focus on her and somehow override the command to preserve her memories. Hey everyone, it's me from the future. I'm here to re-record a section where I went over my problems with time travel and evolution, because I didn't do a very good job. Now, the first thing to do is establish how time travel works in the original show, and a lot of people don't think that's possible because they never really directly say anything about it. But if you just watch the show and use a little bit of logic, you can actually figure out all of the rules for time travel pretty easily. Let's just ask the first question. 1. Who is sent back in time? Is it just the people who are scanned, or is it everyone on Earth? And maybe the universe, but we don't know if aliens exist in Code Lyoko, so just ignore that. Just assume Earth here. The answer is everyone. How do we know this? Well, if you look back at episode 59, The Secret, William helped the team stop a possessed demolitions expert from destroying the factory. And then they did a Return to the Past to, erase his memories because at the time he wasn't on the team. But later on in episode 64, Double Trouble, William tells Yumi that he's been having dreams about that exact scenario in incredible detail, like just exactly what happened.
I had another dream about you last night.
Is that so?
There was this giant computer in this huge room like a factory, And then both you and I were on this bridge fighting against some factory worker who was doing these wild acrobatics.
You really dreamed that?
Yeah. I've been having that same dream for a really long time.
The only way for him to have memories suppressed within his brain to then come up in his dreams is if this William has experienced those things. And heck, even at the end of the episode, when Yumi is recruiting him, William says, "So you're telling me that that wasn't a dream?" And she responds, "No," confirming that what he was seeing there wasn't just some random thoughts. If for whatever reason you were doubting that, it is 100% that he has repressed memories from those times, which means that the computer either can only mostly remove memories and then just repress the rest of it, or it always just represses it and maybe sometimes it comes back up. It's unclear how much of it is, but what we do know is that the supercomputer does in fact leave some remnants of memories within you to the point where they can surface in places like dreams. So yeah, that confirms that everyone gets sent back in time, not just the Lyoko team. It's just that the Lyoko team don't have their memories erased, whereas people who aren't scanned get their memories erased from the start of the return up to the point of where they return to. That's how it works. Now the next question we need to answer is, what is being sent back in time? The physical body or the consciousness? Now this may seem like a question that you can't really answer, as in pretty much every instance, when time is reversed, we don't actually get confirmation if the scene that we start seeing is the exact return point, or if it's just where the episode's picking up at. Because usually the scene that starts playing after the Return to the Past is just the first scene from the episode, but then it plays out differently based on what the characters learned. And thus we can't actually confirm if that's when they were being sent back to. However, there is a reason I worded the statement the way I did, because there is in fact one episode where you can confirm what the return point is. Episode 30, A Great Day. In this episode, Xana takes control of the Return to the Past program and runs it several times throughout the episode. And each time, it returns to Jeremy waking up in his bedroom. What's very important to notice is that when Jeremy wakes up for the first time this happens, he is visibly confused, which confirms that this is in fact the exact return point, because if it returned him at a point earlier when he was awake, then he wouldn't be confused because he would already have figured it out.
It's already 7 o'clock in the morning on Sky Radio. Look out your window. The sun is shining, the birds are singing.
But I didn't program going back in time.
The second important piece of information to notice is that Jeremy is no longer wearing his normal clothes, and his glasses are not on his face, like they were before the Return to the Past happened. This means that the Return to the Past did not send him back as he was. It did not send his physical body there, because if it did, he would have his normal clothes on and his glasses would be on his face. This confirms that physical objects are not sent back in time. Now, while doing research for this video, I came across two examples where people supposedly mentioned that time travel rules are both not followed very consistently, and also where physical objects did go back in time. The first example that people bring up is episode 84, Guided Missile, where Jim has a jar of dog food, and people say that he shouldn't have it after the Return to the Past because I guess like he wasn't supposed to get it yet. So I'm assuming people believe that the scene at the end of the episode is taking place before the scene in the lunchroom. Now, why would people think that? I'm assuming it's because the letter that Jeremy wrote is on his desk and not in Ilea's possession. So people must be thinking, oh, Jeremy returned to the past before the mail was delivered, so the only way this scene can happen is that it's taking place before the actual mail delivery. But the thing is that there's a very easy way to explain this and have everything make sense. The first important thing to note is that, well, he lives on campus, so he doesn't need to wait several days to mail this letter. He could literally just go up to the mailbox and drop the letter into the bucket or whatever that before the mail is handed out. So all he had to do is return to the past before he actually did that, which would probably be that exact morning because he lives there, so he knows when mail day is. So he wouldn't need to do it in advance. He would just have to do it the day of. Then they go to lunch. The scene happens where Odd gives Jim the jar of dog food, but Ilita doesn't get the letter. She goes to Jeremy's room afterward to try and talk about it, sees the letter open on his desk, which Jeremy left there intentionally for her to find. They then have the discussion. Jim comes in. We have that scene, and the episode ends. And bam! Very easy explanation. It explains why Jim has the jar of dog food and why he knows that he got it from Odd, because it's already happened. They redid the scene just off screen. That's pretty dang easy to figure out, at least in my opinion. I don't know why people are confused about that. It just makes a lot of sense. Another thing that people might say is that, well, this time around, after the Return to the Past, Odd actually is the one who went to go fly in the jet, so you would have had to have left earlier than the scene happened originally the first time around, and therefore he couldn't give Jim the dog food. But another way to think about it is that because he was going to go ride it in the jet, he then had to give his dog food to Kiwi earlier, and then Jim happened to be walking by the door, so the scene happens just maybe a few hours earlier than it did in the original timeline, and it all just kind of plays out the same way. Sure, you have to make the assumption that Jim would actually do his rounds earlier, or that he did 2 cycles and he just passed by the second time at roughly the same moment again. But at the same time, it's like that is way more plausible and understandable than just the rules of time travel being completely broken. And even if I'm wrong about it, it was just included as a joke at the end of the episode. Breaking continuity is still bad, but since it was just for a gag, I'm willing to forgive it if only a little bit. It's certainly better, though, than what happened in Evolution, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Now, the other example that people are 100% right about is the finale of Season 1, False Start. In this episode, Aelita is on Earth for the very first time, and Jeremy and Aelita go to a photo booth and make a bunch of photos. But then they have to do a return to the past afterward because Xana invaded. And as the rules would dictate, physical objects shouldn't be there that they made in that time period. But at the very end of the episode, Jeremy pulls out one of the photos, looks at it, and then puts it back in his pocket before the episode ends. That is pretty blatant. Like, he has an object from the future, a future that doesn't even exist anymore. So you think, oh, so you're wrong then. Physical objects do get sent back in time, or at the very least, the show is inconsistent about its time travel rules. And I mean, that second one is, I would definitely say, is right. But it's important to remember something, and it's that the literary Bible of the show got a big rewrite after Season 1. Like, originally, Aelita was a computer program. There wasn't a reveal that, oh, she was more than that. No, originally, she was just a computer program. Looking back at the interview with Sophie de Crozet, she mentions how she rewrote the literary Bible after Season 1 to add both more backstory and also to kind of finalize things and make things more concrete. She even stated that in her, at least in her opinion, the concept was very minimal, so things weren't probably thought out as deeply with the very well-established rules. But after that, from Season 2 onward, things were more finalized and things are retconned, again, like Aelita being an actual person, not a computer program. So the rules of the universe in Season 1 do not inherently apply to the rules of the universe from Season 2 onward, because they were rewritten at that point. So in my opinion, anything that happens in Season 2 that contradicts something in Season 1 takes precedent over it, because it's taking place after the story rewrite, so it would most likely be considered more canon based on the rules of the literary Bible in its current state. And well, the episode where Xana does reversing time a whole lot is season 2, which in my opinion would therefore mean that it takes precedent over this example in episode 26. Now, these are the only 2 examples that I've heard about, but maybe there's more, and possibly one that even happens after the rewrite. And just to cover all my bases, I will consider that hypothetical situation in the next arguments. And one last thing I want to mention that helps to support this even more is that this explains why people stay dead when time reverses. After you die, your consciousness leaves your body and moves on to the next plane of existence. Now in Code Lyoko, we don't know if there is an afterlife, so it could just go to the void. But that doesn't really matter. The point is, your consciousness is not in your body anymore, which means there's no longer a consciousness for the computer to send back in time. So even though this time period that has been returned to, in that moment, your body was completely healthy, no injuries or anything, there's no consciousness to put into that body. So it's just clinically dead. It just doesn't do anything. It just sits there. Now, something that some people might bring up is that, well, the physical body has to be sent back in time, right? Because they still retain their memories. Or for people who are not scanned, it's repressed. And the brain is what retains your memories, so it has to be the physical body being sent back, right? Well, no, the consciousness can retain memories, or at least that's what I believe. But just in case you don't believe that, well, in the show, there is an episode that has consciousness swapping, and they retain their memories. That episode is episode 42, A Fine Mess, where Yumi and Odd swap bodies. And it is just their consciousness, not their brains, because, well, physically nothing else changes, so why would there be a brain swap? And 2, Jeremy doesn't actually say anything about a brain swap, and he's a stickler for details. He would have brought it up. Now, in the episode, when they speak, they do actually have their normal voices coming out of the other character's body, but none of the characters in the show address it, including people who don't know that they swap bodies. So it's pretty clear that it is just for the viewer's sake and not actually happening in universe, meaning that physical things like their vocal cords or whatever have not swapped.
Well, look who's here, Romeo and Juliet.
Sissy, I can't believe it. What a lame brain.
My dear Ulrich, when will you understand that I am the girl for you?
And just in case you weren't satisfied with that, there's more evidence that the physical body isn't being transported back in time. In episode 14, The Trap, the elevator falls with Ulrich inside of it, and he breaks his arm. Yet at the end of the episode, after time has been reversed, he is applying pressure to that exact same arm without any problems whatsoever. There's also episode 45, Cold War, where a tree falls on top of Yumi's legs. After returning back to the past, she is standing in line for food, completely unharmed, and seemingly with no complications whatsoever. Alright, so now that the rules of consciousness and time travel have been well established, what are my problems with evolution? Well, in episode 17, an associate of Tyron, who is posing as like a recruiter for a college, gives Laura a business card for a school that's supposed to be about quantum physics and stuff and like that, which is very interesting to her, and so she holds on to it. But it's really just them trying to find out where the computer is so that they can stop the Lyoko team. They eventually did return to the past and convinced Tyron that Katic Academy was not in fact where the computer was, so the moment that the associate arrived this time, they immediately got back in their car to move on to the next location, meaning that there was never a chance for him to give Laura the business card. And yet we see in that episode that she still has it. Now, as we just established with everything else before this, that breaks the rules of time travel. Physical objects do not go back in time, except for that one time in season 1, but again, it was retconned. Now, why did they do this? Why? To further the plot, of course! For you see, after Jeremy erased Laura's memories, she now just has this business card but doesn't know what it is, and once she comes across it again, she calls a number on it to try and figure out what it's about, and unbeknownst to her, she accidentally gives away the fact that the Lyoko team is at Katic Academy. And that's why they did it. Just so they can get Tyron to the school for the finale. Even though they had shown in episode 17 that Tyron doesn't need some convenience to find them. He is smart enough and resourceful enough to do it on his own. They didn't need to break the rules to do this, but they did it anyway because they couldn't think of another way to do it. And I don't get it. And the other thing is, like, in the interview with the creators of Evolution, they talked about how Laura is a very pivotal character and she's very important, but she doesn't change anything. Like, she didn't really have any impact on the character's growth. They grew, honestly, without her. She was just always there for conflict's sake. She didn't help them to become better people or better at what they did. Now, in the hypothetical situation where there's another example of time travel being inconsistent in the original show, or if you think that episode 26 should hold more weight than I think it does, I still think it is a problem that this happened in evolution. Now, you may be saying, why? I mean, it's consistent with the original show in that instance, in that hypothetical scenario, and you would be right, which would, in my mind, normally lessen it because at least it's a consistent problem. But then you think about it the other way. They have made this show after the original. They now have the benefit of hindsight to look back and see, oh yeah, that's a problem. Now, why is it a problem? Well, in episode 26, where they had that thing, that established at the time, oh, physical objects can go back. And that is a massive plot hole, because that now opens the door for things that could solve problems later on just by sending physical objects back in time. So you can't do that. Like, if you do that, you have now written yourself into a corner where you now have to constantly address this fact going forward. So yeah, it is bad that they did that in season 1, but at the very least, it was just for like a heartfelt scene for the season finale. In Evolution, it's done for the sake of the plot, and according to them and how they wrote it, it couldn't have gone further without this moment happening. Tyrone would have lost completely without this happening. And it's just kind of ridiculous. Also, I kind of just glanced over the fact that Laura's memories are just completely wiped of all Lyoko things, but nothing else. And, like, she's fine. Like, she's not questioning why she has gaps in her memories. Somehow, Jeremy rewrote the program to do it so thoroughly and so perfectly that she knows nothing about Lyoko or anything that she did was associated with it, and yet does not question the fact that, oh, I just have several days worth of memories missing of just blank periods where I just did nothing, I guess? Like, that's just insane. In the original show, Franz Hopper says that he discovered the Return to the Past, which made people think that maybe he just found the program.
I wanted to destroy the supercomputer and destroy all the evidence of my activities. That's when I discovered one of its fascinating properties, returning to the past. It gave me all the time I could possibly need to perfect my great project. The only thing that would allow me to escape my enemies.
But I think that one, that could just be a dubbing problem, but if it is how it is in the French version, then the other explanation would be that, like, when he says he discovered the right coding procedures needed to make this program work. Because, like, I can't imagine he just found a program to reverse time somewhere. That just seems ridiculous. I'm pretty sure it's the latter. And it was after living several years and, building this computer and, like, just having a lot of experience and knowledge under his belt. Jeremy doesn't have that. Like, sure, he has Hopper's notes and the basis of the program to work off of, which means he could definitely learn how to do it faster, at least relatively. But to do it to the degree he did, I think is just... It's just ridiculous. I don't think it's plausible. It feels out of character. It doesn't make any logical sense. There are just so many things wrong with how they handled time travel right near the end of the show. And how could anyone think that was a good idea? How? It's so bad. Alright, well, I think that's everything. If not, you'll see me again. But we're gonna go ahead and head on back to Past Me. Really past me. Let's briefly go over the music. The music honestly rarely felt like Code Lyoko to me. There were maybe 2 tracks that sounded like they fit in the Code Lyoko world, and one track in particular sounds exactly like a piece from the original show. In episode 20, from 1801 to 1926, there's a piece that sounds very familiar, with the guitar at the end being especially so. I can't find anything about it, but if anyone knows an episode from the original show where it may have shown up, please let me know. Like, if I'm right and it is a piece from the original show, it makes me wonder why they didn't reuse or remix more music, since it would be nostalgic for the fans and would better capture the atmosphere of the show. Aside from that, the only piece that really grew on me was the virtualization theme, and that was about it. Nothing great, but nothing terrible either. It was just meh.
Scanner prêt. Pareil pour le transfert. Scanner Aelita. Scanner on.
Virtualisation.
And with that, we can finally get to what is arguably the most important aspect of this sequel. Did it give the show a better conclusion and answer the remaining questions? And the answer is a big, fat no. We don't learn more about what Carthage is, we don't learn why Xana went rogue, and while we did learn about where Anthea is, at the end of the show, the Cortex is shut down, so there's no way to contact her anymore and figure out where she is or what will happen to her next, since Tyron revealed that he already got all of Schaefer's files that he needed. And with Tyron being added to the lore, we are left with questions about him as well. In other words, we actually ended with more questions than we started with. What's even worse is that Xana isn't even really dead at the end anymore. While they managed to upload the virus to the Cortex, Tyron caught on to what they were trying to do and started shutting down the computer as they were doing it. Because of this, the virus never activated and Xana is still alive. And while turning it back on will cause it to activate, Yumi points out that he didn't seem discouraged and that he could probably find a way to block it. So now Xana is just kind of trapped instead of dead. And with how poorly Evolution was received, this is probably all we'll ever get. In summary, Evolution answered only one question, but added more questions on top of it, and brought the main antagonist back to life, only to leave his fate up to chance. What a terrible and unsatisfying conclusion. If the purpose of a Code Lyoko sequel is to leave things more conclusive and satisfactory, as any sequel really should do, it failed on all accounts. But that just raises another question. If the directors had watched the entire show, how could they have failed so miserably? Well, part of it is likely due to the fact that while the directors watched the show, most, if not all of the writers did not. The directors mentioned that they had to explain the concept of Code Lyoko to the new writing team, implying they had no prior experience with it. I'm sure there were a few outliers, as well as some that watched some of the show as they worked on it, but without having access to any interviews with the said writers, there's no way to know for sure. Another reason is that a lot of it had to do with the time and budget of the show. Going back to the interview with the directors again, they revealed that they were contacted for the project around April 2011. Since the show started airing in December of 2012, they would have needed to have most, if not all of their footage done by then, meaning the show was made in little over a year and a half. To further complicate things, the directors spent some of that time watching the entire series before they started working on everything, and for the live action parts, they only had access to the school for 2 months, and they hadn't met the cast until April 2012. So, the amount of time they had to make and write for the Earth sections of the show was limited. Now, the reasons for these constraints were likely due to 2 things. First being that they didn't have a lot of money. Moonscoop would eventually go bankrupt on January 24th, 2014, so they had to have been doing poorly from a financial standpoint already. The second is possibly due to Code Lyoko Chronicles. The original Italian releases started on May 11th, 2009 and finished in November of 2010. And while books are not as expensive to make as a TV show, it still costs quite a bit to pay the writers, editors, translators, and distributors to make and sell a book in multiple languages in several different countries. Not only had the company already spent a presumably decent amount of money on a project that they halted back in January of 2011 due to poor book sales, according to that Code Lyoko fan site, the books still provided the answers to the story that the original lacked, so they took away the narrative necessity for a sequel as well. So trying to convince Moonscoop to fund another sequel was probably not that easy. By canceling the translations of Chronicles and funding Evolution, all of the money they had spent on it had basically been wasted. So they also probably didn't have the money needed to fund a larger production. However, I do want to make it clear that this doesn't excuse the low quality of the writing and acting of the show. While giving the writers more time to do rewrites and brainstorming could have resulted in fewer issues, they still wrote the story the way they did. And regarding the acting, the directors admitted to casting actors not based on experience, but how in tune with the character they felt they were. They mentioned that they picked Gulliver because the way he moves, behaves, and talks is similar to Odd, but I think they were talking about him as a person, not his acting performance. Because I'm gonna be honest here, just like all the other ones, he most of the time did not feel like the character he was portraying. It sounds to me like the directors didn't realize that while a person's natural behavior may match a character, it doesn't mean they're good at forcing it for the camera. Noah Ringer, who played Aang in M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender, is a great example of this. In behind-the-scenes footage, he's clearly a fun and energetic kid like Aang from the show, but because he was so young and had no prior experience with acting, he wasn't able to play the part very well. But to reiterate from earlier, it's also the fault of the writers and directors for some of the bad performances given in any show or movie, since it's their job to give the actors good dialogue and to tell them exactly how to act out a scene. They also admitted to altering the literary Bible, which can explain many of the inconsistencies with the rules of the original. And that terrible ending was a deliberate decision by the directors because they knew this sequel had a very uncertain chance to succeed. At the end of the interview, they said, "On our part, we sincerely believe we have made the best possible, at least, let's say rather that I think that we couldn't have done better with the amount of time and the means that we were given. The amount of time that we had was very short, and above all, the hybrid between the 3D animation and live action was a first and a total challenge." This to me screams a lack of confidence in the success of their work, which is supported by the fact that the ending is written in a way where, if the show was successful, the writers could say, Tyron found a way to stop the virus, so our heroes need to fight Xana once again. And if it failed, they could just say, Tyron failed to stop it, meaning Xana is either trapped for eternity or he dies when he tries to turn her back on. The problem with this open-ended approach, however, is that it makes the finale feel incredibly unsatisfying, especially when compared to the definitive ending of the original. And the scenario where Xana dies or is imprisoned forever is an outcome that is incredibly hard to believe based on Tyron's confidence, him having Schaefer's notes, and characters like Laura existing, as it shows that random smart people can outwit Jeremy even in areas that they have little to no experience in. If they were that concerned with how the show would go, they should have just given it a more definitive ending. Maybe the story would have been better written if the original writers were involved, but they chose to remain in the background and helped write the first few episodes. Sophie had actually written the literary Bible for Evolution and some of the synopsises with Jerome Mascadet, the director of the original, but after seeing that the story was being taken in a direction that she didn't agree with, she quit the production. If the head writer for a story that you're trying to adapt disagrees with what you're doing, that should be a massive red flag. But to give them the benefit of the doubt, they did say that they wanted to make an evolving season with real development in the plot, despite being encouraged to do the opposite, which could imply that there may have been some amount of executive interference with the project, but it's unclear to what extent that may be, if there was any at all. Still, regardless of what the reasons may be, Evolution is still a mess of a show that varied between being boring, disappointing, or infuriating to watch, and is without question a failure as a sequel. And looking at my poll again, we're mostly in agreement. While there were a few that thought it was decent, most of the responses criticized it for pretty much the exact same reasons I listed above. In regards to the ending, most either didn't like it or felt that it was fine for a season finale, but not a series finale. There were also a few more inconsistencies and changes I didn't mention, but most of them either had a good explanation, or they were so similar to the ones I had already brought up that would have been redundant. For instance, they moved the timeline of the show up 10 years, but the reason for that is clearly they didn't have the time or the budget to make props or buy stuff from several years ago to fit this current timeline of the show, so by bumping up the timeline, they could just use the stuff that was at the school. It's an understandable choice, and while I do feel like this would have actually impacted the story and characters in a major way in real life, for the sake of the story and just the budget, I can accept it. If you want a list of most of the changes in Evolution, there's a link in the description that lists the ones the fans found. Man, that was a lot. I didn't expect to spend so much time on Evolution alone, but now that it's over, we can finally move on to Code Lyoko Chronicles. Just a heads up, I gloss over several parts of the books in order to keep this section as concise as possible, so I highly recommend that you read them first before going further. I know I already gave my spoiler warning at the beginning, but I just want to give it again, you really ought to read the books here in this situation. The link's in the description, they're free, and they'll take you at max 4 days to read them all. At least that's how long it took me, but I probably could have done it in 2 if I really wanted to. So, I mean, it's not like it's going to be a deep read. You can do it pretty quickly and then just come back again. Alright, right out of the gate, I need to address the strengths and weaknesses of Chronicles being a book series over a television series. As a book, you don't have to worry about bad acting running a line because you can imagine the line being delivered how you think it should in the voice that you think it should. But this is also an issue as the delivery for some lines can be harder to figure out than others, and it's possible that a director and a voice actor could figure out a way for a line to be delivered that's better than you imagined. You can also imagine the story in the original 2D animation of the show instead of having to accept a bunch of new actors and new set pieces that don't look quite right. But you also won't be able to enjoy the spectacle of a well-animated fight scene. And of course, there's no music to enhance those scenes either. Keeping that in mind, let's take a look at this series one book at a time, with some overall thoughts here and there. Now, the first book was burdened with the unfortunate task of recapping the original series for people who didn't watch the show, since, they have to consider that people will buy the books first and not watch the show. Especially since, back then, the show wasn't available on YouTube, at least legally, for everyone to watch. And what the authors decided to do is give Aelita amnesia to justify the rest of the main cast retelling the story to her in the form of recording a video diary. This amnesia lasts for almost the entire book, and because retelling gets interrupted every now and again, it's spaced out across several chapters and takes up about 1/4 of the entire book. Now, I was shown a very negative review of Chronicles by Really Salty Peppers that I'll be bringing up every now and again to show a perspective of the novel that I personally had never seen before. In regards to the recap chapters, they felt that it would have been better to do it in a short blurb at the beginning and then move on. And while that would save a lot of time for old fans and gives the story more room to develop, it would likely leave new fans feeling uninterested in the story and characters. Think about it. Would you be more invested in the story if you read the equivalent of a Wikipedia summary on it, or if you read a condensed yet semi-detailed retelling of it? I don't know about you, but the latter is the obvious choice for me. A summary doesn't tell me who a character is or how they act and feel. That's something you can only truly understand by experiencing the narrative in a more personal and detailed manner. The author could technically fix this issue by ignoring new fans altogether, but then the books would be aiming for a smaller audience, sales would go down, and the books would be at risk of cancellation. And to briefly mention the Aelita amnesia thing, the review makes it sound like she's a completely blank slate, but that's not entirely true. By chapter 2, she manages to regain her memories of everything except for stuff about Lyoko, conveniently. So while some of her development as a character is temporarily undone for this book, and it's a shame to not have her as she should be from the get-go, to say that she's a blank slate is an exaggeration of the issue. However, there is one more issue with the recap that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's that it retcons a lot of stuff. See, there's a clear limitation on the length of these books, as their page numbers are all somewhere in the 280s, meaning that the authors were either paid by the word and Moonscoop only agreed to pay them a certain amount per book, or there was a decision to keep it short enough to entice young readers. Again, most likely a decision by Moonscoop, since they were the ones who were commissioning the work in the first place. This meant that if the author wanted to have a detailed recap of the show's plot without making it the entire book, he would have to condense and rewrite the story in a few areas. As a result, certain events are altered like the first few missions on Lyoko, and some are completely removed, such as the events of seasons 2, 3, and most of 4. The biggest effect of that last one is that in the recap of the final battle, several things are different, like the Lyoko warriors not having their new outfits, the vehicles not existing until Jeremy creates the overbike for the first time in the final battle against the Colossus, and Jeremy directly working with Schaefer on the multi-agent system to destroy Xana. Whereas before, he only gave him like a little bit of the piece he was kind of missing to make sure it didn't mess up terribly. There are also several minor changes that don't make sense, like crabs shooting from their claws, mantas shooting from their tails, a tarantula showing up in the second mission, and the Colossus is described as having 2 fists instead of a sword for an arm. Though those last 2 were likely because the authors wanted to include the tarantulas in some way for fans since Season 2 would be skipped, and the sword armor was likely removed so that the Colossus would only have 1 weak point and could be taken down faster. And even still, there is one major retcon where Aelita got shot in the head as she and Schaefer were escaping to Lyoko, meaning she wouldn't have seen the secret pathway to the factory that would later help them in the show. Now, hearing all of this, you would think that this series is doomed to fail. How couldn't it? It's retconned so much of the original source material to the point where it isn't even really a true continuation anymore. How could anyone possibly like this? It's even less faithful than Evolution. And you'd be correct if retcons actually mattered to the story. While all the retcons are a major detractor for the first book specifically, as soon as the second book begins, the introduction mentions how after Aelita was materialized, they continue to fight against Xana on incredible virtual adventures, despite the fact that the first book heavily implied none of that ever happened. The minor retcons like mantas shooting from their tails can be safely ignored because, unlike Evolution, you can imagine the monsters acting properly without a visual to contradict it and reinforce the change. Also, while this will be mentioned more in detail later, like in the first book, there is a picture in the middle of a manta shooting from its mouth. So the authors knew that mantas shoot from their mouths, but for whatever reason, it says they shoot from their tails. My first thought was maybe this is a translation error, but like these are Code Lyoko fans translating this, and they know how that mantas shoot from their mouths. So I'm sure when they translated that, they would have been like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. And they probably checked it several times, like, well, no, that's what it says, and their job is to translate, not necessarily to fix any issues. So they translated it as written. So it's strange why they got that wrong, despite showing evidence that they know how it's supposed to be. And the major retcon where Aelita gets shot actually doesn't end up mattering by the end of the series. While the fact that she was shot is brought up every now and again, the author does nothing with it, meaning it was likely just included for shock value to give the end of book 1 more of an impact. Like seriously, like her being shot does not factor into anything at all. The fact that the retcons even exist does detract from the overall quality of the series, yes. But because none of it matters to the story, and almost all of the material that doesn't relate to the recap can easily work with the original canon, save for the lack of vehicles, the heroes' Season 4 designs, and one other thing that'll be relevant later, it's very easy for fans of the show who know the story to just ignore them and move on. Heck, with the exception of the Green Phoenix logo that's added in several parts of the sewer path and the factory to create a connection with a future antagonistic force, you could literally rewrite the entire recap in the first book and remove any mentions of the retcons in the other 3, and the story would still play out exactly the same. Again, with one exception, but it isn't relevant until much later. So for me, it doesn't really make sense to say mad at these changes when almost none of them even end up mattering. In fact, for those who may want to reread the books, or for those who didn't read them but will after this video, if you've watched the show and understand the lore and backstory of the characters, you can safely skip any chapter with the phrase "some time ago" in the chapter subtitle to avoid the recap altogether. And the only important thing you'll miss out on is the detail of the Green Phoenix logo being added in a few places. But that's mentioned again in later books, so it doesn't really hurt your experience either. Aelita getting shot is actually revealed in a non-recap chapter, so you can't skip over that. But again, nothing's ever done with it, so you can treat it like it never happened. Oh, Aelita and Anthea are also described as having red hair instead of pink, but the cover still shows it as pink, so it's really there to explain why no one finds it weird that someone has naturally pink hair, and it also has no effect on the story. Just figured I'd mention that. Alright, now that the elephant in the room has been addressed, we can cover some other aspects of Book 1. The main difference between Chronicles and the other parts of the Lyoko canon is how the story is structured. Unlike Evolution, Xana's return is slow and methodical, as the only reason it survived is because the fragments of him left were so small that Jeremy and Schaefer's program couldn't detect them. And because it's so weak, it has to take time to build itself back up again, and goes about getting its revenge in more subtle ways, since Lyoko isn't accessible, and there is no supercomputer like the Cortex to attack in the ways he used to. As a result, the heroes never find a need to turn the supercomputer back on, and even when hints of Xana's return start to crop up, they always experience them when they're alone, so they all think they're being paranoid because of how terrifying Xana was back in the day. That, and they don't want to even consider the fact that he could return, because, like, they don't want to go through that shit again. So with no supercomputer and Xana attacks, most of the books take place on Earth, and even when they do get involved in the virtual world, it isn't to stop another typical Xana attack like in the original. The books are basically told in a different genre from the original, going from an action/monster of the week, or I guess Xana attack of the week, if you will, style, where the plot might develop every few episodes or so, to a drama mystery that is primarily focused on expanding the story and answering the questions left at the end of Season 4. Aside from parts of Book 1, the story always feels like it's moving forward, which was very refreshing after sitting through several episodes of Code Lyoko where the story and characters didn't actually develop. And that was honestly the smartest decision to make, since a large part of what made that style of storytelling so exciting in the original was getting to see the unique and strange attacks that Xana would come up with. So instead of trying to continue the story in that same way, David and Pier Domenico decides to focus on what a lot of the fans wanted in the first place, expanding and finishing the story. In regards to writing, the characters feel really spot on. While there are a few instances where you aren't directly told who's speaking, particularly in the first book, you see the pattern here. The dialogue for each of the characters, both new and old, is usually so distinctly them that you can figure it out pretty quickly. After sitting through Evolution, it was great to feel like Ike was actually experiencing a story about our main cast again. Now, another thing I want to bring up is William. Again, just like Evolution. He briefly shows up, but Ulrich forces Yumi into the snow so he doesn't see them, and he walks away. Aside from the recaps, that's all he does in Book 1. But because of the length issue brought up earlier, it's understandable that they couldn't fit him in here, so maybe he could get a chance later on. Come back to that. In regards to the other things Xana does in this book, he eventually possesses a blonde American girl named Eva Skinner and slowly relearns how to move about and use his powers, while also regaining its memories as more and more fragments are found. Despite that, Xana is still incredibly menacing, doing things like mugging a woman for her clothes, since at the time Eva only had a hospital gown on, knocks out a police officer and impersonates him to avoid being taken into the station, and books a flight in first class to Europe to exact its revenge. Despite being weaker than the Xana of Evolution, I feel much more intimidated by this Xana, and they seem to actually have a plan for what they want to do, instead of just sending a Spectre every so often. Moving on to Book 2, the story is able to progress more now that the recap is done and over with. However, the story is primarily focused on laying the groundwork for the rest of the series by introducing new characters like a friend Alita had back when she went to school in 1994, the Green Phoenix, and members of the Men in Black, laying the groundwork for the backstories of characters like Xana, and unraveling the mysteries of Carthage. There is so much set up in this book. Xana Eva shows up at Caddick and enrolls there and slowly tries to worm their way into the group, and with Odd falling in love with Eva, they succeed in doing so. And while its plans are all falling into place, the rest of the team learn more about the supercomputer and what Schaefer was up to. Ulrich and Yumi find an interface in Brussels that allows them to access a mysterious place that will eventually be known as the First City, and Alita discovers a new hidden room in the Hermitage with a scanner. She finds Jeremy to man the computer as she goes in, and what she finds is an extensive virtual diary of Schaefer's life that they dub the Mirror. We see him and Anthea learning that Project Carthage will be used for evil, that Anthea was kidnapped by a man named Mark James Hollenbach, the original name of the head of the Green Phoenix, Hannibal Mago. Yes, that's his name that he picked for himself. Whatever. And that Waldo was helped by a woman named Major Steinbeck, who the reader can figure out through context clues is actually Professor Hertz. There's also a character named Grigory Nyctopoulos who works for the Green Phoenix that has set up cameras and bugs into Aelita's room and the Hermitage to spy on them to gather intel. He also attacks Odd's father and both of Yumi's parents and uses a memory-stealing device to store some of their memories onto a floppy disk to gain further, more personal info on the kids. He also has 2 Rottweilers that attack Kiwi at one point, which makes him even more hateable on top of his skills with espionage to make him an interesting and intimidating villain. In regards to the device that he used for stealing memories, there are actually some interesting photos in the middle of the book of real-life objects and props of things in the book, such as the memory device and a picture of Aelita's childhood friend Richard, so you get a feel for what he looks like. Pictures like these are included in all the books, and while I think they're great, they also have an issue. On these pages, there's info and photos for things that happen in both halves of the book, meaning there are minor spoilers if you choose to look at them before finishing the book. Back to the story, Grigory had rushed to get away from the De La Robia residence, resulting in him leaving the memory disk for Odd's father behind. He takes it to Eva, who has proven her capabilities with computers, to decipher it. He could have taken it to Jeremy, but he wanted an excuse to see her. On the disk, we see a memory of Anthea being tortured before fading to static. And when Odd tries to leave to tell the others, Xana stops him and possesses him as well. And that's where book 2 ends, with Xana completely unopposed, mysteries unraveling, and a dangerous man spying on them from a crime lord. I did scope over a few things, but there's so much to cover, and I'm trying to stay focused on important plot points needed for the review. Plus, this is meant to be an analysis, not a recap. In case you didn't notice, William once again does nothing in this book, and I'm going to get into my thoughts on that in the next book. Alright, so book 3 is where things start to come to a head. Now, I've tried to summarize the books as much as possible on top of analyzing them, but so much happens in the last 2 books that we'll be here all day if I continue at this rate, so I'm mostly going to jump to the points of importance. Hence the reason why you should read the books. The first important thing to mention is that in the first chapter, Mago has a red-haired assistant named Memory with a gold pendant, which, if you've been paying attention to the story so far, and that ridiculous name, it's clearly Anthea. Her memories were stolen as well, which is why she's helping Mago. Next, it's revealed at one point that Odd's father, Yumi... Wait, what? Odd's father, Yumi's parents? Next, it's revealed at one point that Odd's father, Yumi's parents, Ulrich's father, and Jeremy's father worked alongside Professor Hertz with Waldo on the supercomputer and the systems within, since he wanted to still use Carthage for good as he had intended originally. Now, this is admittedly very contrived. The idea that the children of the people that helped Waldo in the past just so happened to go to the same school, become friends, and discover the supercomputer is so impossibly convenient that it feels like it came straight out of a fanfiction. And yet, I find it hard to hate it. I don't know, I just really love the idea that this all started with a group of individuals and that 10 years later, their kids would be helping Waldo's daughter to finish it all. It may have come out of nowhere and made little to no sense, but I love the idea behind it. Now, the reason none of the parents knew anything before this is because the memory snatching device, which they had invented to input memories of places to generate them on Lyoko, was used on everyone's parents because the men in black were after them, and they needed to make it impossible for them to trace it back to them. The reason they found them in the first place is because Walter, Ulrich's father, ratted them out because he was promised a second chance by the government, after he had worked for the Green Phoenix, which is where the funding for the factory and computer came from. Walter starts to remember things and wants to atone, and Hertz returns the memories to their parents so that they can help out. While in the mirror, Xana-possessed Odd and Yumi learn a lot about all of this and about things like Code Down, a program designed to delete all of Lyoko, the mirror, and the first city to keep it out of dangerous hands. Xana reveals himself, and long story short, Aelita eventually makes it into the mirror and decides to stay with Xana because since book 2, it was slowly revealed that they were friends and that Aelita used to play with Xana in the first city to help him learn how to be more human. She doesn't remember much of those times, but hopes that he can help her and that she can in turn convince him to aid them against the Green Phoenix. Now, I don't necessarily have an issue with the author trying to redeem Xana, or at least make him sympathetic, but the problem is how it's executed. While I expected to read about a lot of heartwarming moments between Xana and Aelita when they were young to help humanize him, it's instead all glossed over and we just jump to the point where Aelita has remembered their time together and wants to try and help him out. The reason for this rush development is most likely due, once again, to the limit on the length of the books, as there are so many characters to flesh out and events to occur that some inevitably get more time to develop than others. Now, Xana had been struggling with some of his human emotions throughout the book from possessing Eva for so long, and he later comes to understand that he wants to be human. He asks Aelita if he can help him get a body, but she's unsure if it's even possible, which upsets him, so Xana leaves her alone for the rest of the book. The other issue with all this is that Xana committed so many horrible acts and likely killed a few innocent people in the past, that to try and redeem him and turn his motivation into wanting to be human seems ridiculous and a betrayal of his character. To get around this, though, they give him a reason for him going rogue all those years ago, and apparently it was some sort of bug in the Carthage program that locked away all his emotions except for anger, meaning that he was incapable of being sympathetic or kind. And while that may take away some of his responsibilities for his actions, he still is the one who did those things. It's also a fairly lame explanation for it to be a simple bug that just happen to him out of nowhere. And it's disappointing that it's not anything more complex than that. Now, the other half of Xana and Eva made it to the first city with Ulrich through the scanner in the Hermitage, and he reveals himself. From the mirror earlier in the book, we learn that a black castle in the first city is the main weapon for Carthage, as it can supposedly create anything, and with the power of the scanners, these things can be manifested in the real world. Naturally, such a thing could be used for both good and evil, so Wallo created Xana as the guardian of the first city, and had him interact with Aelita to help him be more human, so that he could understand a good person from a bad one and stop them from using Carthage. Now, this is a contradiction of what Waldo said in his diary in the show, as he said Xana was created to destroy Carthage, whereas here he was created to protect the program from Carthage.
So I built the supercomputer, created Lyoko, and last of all, Xana, to destroy Carthage.
It's a minor change that doesn't affect the story progression of the original, since Xana's purpose for existing never really mattered to the show, but it's still an inconsistency. Now, going back to Earth, things get worse as the Hermitage and factory are taken over by the Green Phoenix, and Mago, wanting access to the first city, has Jeremy kidnapped and coerces him to go to Lyoko and open up the barrier protecting the first city by threatening to kill Anthea. This moment isn't important for discussion right now, but it will be in the overview, so I need to bring it up here, just to show that I did not forget it. Jeremy goes and unlocks the barrier, and the half of Xana there is able to get to Lyoko and recall his missing fragments from across the internet, except for the one in the mirror since it's not directly connected. Xana is able to communicate with the other half, though, thanks to his new power, and upon learning that Aelita didn't seem to want to help, he contacts Mago and offers to give him an army in exchange for giving him a human body. Mago agrees, and the Carthage program is used to make an army, and they are sent to attack Caddock to get Richard's PDA, which has some code from Waldo. I forgot to bring that up earlier, sorry. There is so much that happens in these books, especially compared to Evolution, that there's too much to cover. The army attacks the school, but they have to recharge at outlets after receiving a lot of damage, so Odd and Richard shut off all the power at the school to drive them off. This is important to mention because everyone at the school fights this army to defend themselves. But William is nowhere to be seen. This is my main criticism that I've been building up to. Despite having knowledge of Xana, he doesn't help in the fight at all. In fact, he does nothing throughout the entire series. He's never given a reason to not be at the school, so why on earth is he not utilized? Well, it's likely related to why certain elements like Xana's redemption was rushed. There simply isn't enough time and space to include an arc for William on top of everything else that needed to be done in the books. If they tried to squeeze him in, other parts of the story would suffer as they would receive less development and focus. Even if the recap from the first book was done away with, that's still only 1/4 of a book that could be used for his character arc, which isn't enough to make it satisfying. And since I'm pretty sure the length and number of the books wasn't fully within the author's control, it's not entirely his fault. But if he knew he couldn't use William, why didn't he write a reason for him to not be involved, like him moving away or going on an extended vacation? By leaving him in Caddock, he becomes a loose thread that distracts the reader by making them ask why William isn't doing anything. It's a simple problem to fix with just a few sentences, but instead it's left unaddressed. Anyway, the Green Phoenix get the PDA, the team has been divided, and Xana is almost at 100% power again. With that, we can finally end this once and for all with Book 4. The major events can be summarized as thus. Through a joint effort with the Men in Black, Hertz, Richard, Odd, and Yumi are able to make it to Lyoko through the scanner in the Hermitage to get to the mirror to find Aelita. Aelita talks with the half of Xana still there and is able to calm him down. Joined by Odd and Yumi, the four of them open a path to Lyoko. Eventually, everyone is reunited again on Lyoko. Xana becomes whole and uses Carthage to make some cool creatures for them to ride into battle, except for Jeremy, who returns to try and help on Earth. In the process, Jeremy also helps Anthea to regain some of her memories. Mago has a kill switch on him that can shut off the computer, hence why Xana and the gang haven't done anything yet, so Jeremy, along with Anthea, devise a plan to render it null and void. Grigory is onto their scheme and tries to stop it, but ultimately he fails. Our heroes come through the scanners and kick a whole lot of mafia ass alongside the Men in Black. Mago is captured, and Aelita is finally reunited with her mother. After that, the Men in Black have to erase everyone's memories, including their own, so that only the higher-ups know about Lyoko, Carthage, and Schaefer. Odd learns of this and warns everyone ahead of time. They use the code down from Hertz's dossier from, Book 2, I believe is when it was introduced, to delete everything. But because they can't materialize Xana and he can't back up his human personality, he has to be deleted with it. It may have been rushed, but I really did grow to like this human Xana. And actually reading the lines, Xana cried, is something I never thought I would ever see. So it ends up being quite an impactful death. The kids are the last ones on the list to have their memories erased, but when they confront Ditto, the head of the Men in Black, I hope I mentioned that already. I'm just realizing that I might not have mentioned that. Oops. They tell her that they had just deleted everything so that the US would be unable to use it. After which, they ask her to let them keep their memories, especially since Aelita and Anthea had finally found one another again. After everything that had happened and everything Jeremy and his friends did to help, she decides not to take their memories and advises them to pretend to have the temporary side effects of memory stealing so that they could avoid it. Ditto's memory is also then erased. In the final chapter, we see everyone meeting together at the Hermitage to celebrate, and there's one last surprise. It's time to bring up that one other retcon that I mentioned all the way back at the start of this section. In Book 3, Waldo did something to Aelita that seemed to cause her a lot of stress and pain, and she appeared to have a fever. By the end, they finally figured out that what he did was he had stored a copy of Lyoko and the first city within her, since it was 1994 and the human brain is capable of storing a lot more data than a floppy disk. In fact, I believe it's 2 terabytes, or... it's a lot of data, surprisingly. This is also the reason for her amnesia at the beginning, because the amount of data in her brain caused so much stress that her memory was prone to failing. The code on the PDA was the password to unlocking this data, and they're able to recreate Lyoko and the first city. And since Aelita remembers Xana's new human identity, they were also able to use the device to recreate him. And that's how it ends. Alright, now that the very rough summary is done, I can go more in depth. Finally. First, let's talk about that ending. I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. As previously mentioned, Xana's redemption arc was incredibly rushed and didn't really feel organic, making him being an ally and hearing Yumi, of all people, saying things like, "What I really miss is Xana, our friend," feel incredibly weird and unjustified. Not only that, but in some past episodes, you see people being carried away on stretchers with blankets over them, which they only do for dead people as far as I'm aware, so Xana does have a few confirmed kills. And the excuse they gave for him doing it isn't well explained. We're just told it and forced to accept it. But since he ultimately chose to die for the sake of the world by keeping Carthage out of government hands, was a great way for him to atone and pay for his crimes while still showing his growth as a character. But as we just read, they recreate Xana from Aelita's memories. Now, there are 2 possible ways of looking at this, and both of them have major issues. The first one is that they managed to recreate Xana entirely as he was down to the last memory, which is a major stretch given the limitations of memory that we've seen. The book tells us that the Foresighters were created from the memories of those types of places, and as we can see, they're not that accurate. Now, to be fair, this device was also used to create the mirror, which is described as being realistic in looking like the real world, so it technically does have that capability, but this is just recreating the Xana from her memory of him. It's how Aelita saw Xana, not how Xana actually was. Xana may have been a computer program, but he developed real human emotions there at the end, and it doesn't make sense that you could recreate that exactly based on someone else's memories of that person, even if Aelita knew him best and a lot of his human attributes were developed from Aelita. And that leads directly into my second interpretation. This interpretation is that this isn't the same Xana and is only a recreation of how Aelita remembers him. While this is the more realistic and likely interpretation of the ending, and it does help to solve the issue of atonement since this technically isn't really Xana, That's also the biggest issue with it. It may have some of the memories of everything that's happened, but it ultimately isn't the Xana that our heroes fought against, the one who fought with him to save the world, and the one who willingly accepted his death for the good of humanity. It's hard to feel good about Xana being back when it really isn't Xana. The second issue lies with the first city in Carthage. The castle infected Xana with the virus that made him evil in the first place, and since he's coming through the scanners to meet them at the end, he's clearly using Carthage to give him a temporary body, meaning anytime he wants to come over, he must actively put himself at risk of causing the same events that happened before. Maybe having a memory of those events will help this Xana to avoid it, and he does mention how, like, oh yeah, I figured it out now, don't worry, there won't be a problem. But again, this is the different Xana, so, it's still a concern, like, using the thing that made you evil in the first place, regardless of if you have a better understanding of it, is still risky. And if they ever succeed in giving him a real body, while I'm 99% sure that they'll just use the code down again to delete it for good, a small part of me wonders if they might try to once again realize Hopper's dream of using the castle as a tool for good. But I believe they're smart enough to know that this isn't worth the risk. Another issue with the story lies with how Hannibal Mago was handled. We know that he had a rough and poor upbringing and that he worked for his power and fortune, but we never really see what happened to him to make him the way he is or to lead him to pursue the power of Project Carthage. As a result, he has a lot of wasted potential, as he could have been much deeper of a character. But the biggest problem has to be with that despite being the person who kidnapped Anthea, attacked her new friends, and basically ruined her life, he and Aelita never have a scene with each other. I'm dead serious. At most, she briefly sees him escaping up the elevator, but she isn't the one to chase after him. A good scene where this could have happened is where Jeremy confronts Mago for the first time. If you replace Jeremy with Aelita, that scene would immediately carry more weight and impact. The review I read shares this sentiment, however, I feel like they started to direct their anger in the wrong direction. They actually believe that the reason Jeremy was captured was so that the author could shoehorn in his Lyoko form for the sake of fan service, and they used that to justify why Aelita wasn't there instead. However, there was a logical reason why she couldn't be in that scene, as she was in the mirror and couldn't be kidnapped, so the story would need to be rewritten to allow it to happen. Now, is it possible that the author wrote the story this way specifically so he could justify putting Jeremy on Lyoko? Maybe, but there's no real evidence to support it either. And besides, it's not like this was the only moment this could have happened. There were several parts of Book 4 that could have been rewritten so that Aelita would be the one to go after him. And after taking him down, they could have been given a scene together. So getting mad at that one scene in particular seems a bit much to me. But they also took it one step further by saying that from the fact that the book is written under the name Jeremy Belpois, they're given the impression that the story is a self-insert fanfiction and that Jeremy wrote Aelita having amnesia just to make him seem more important, and that the prologue implies that she left him for being an egotistical twat. In my opinion, this hate on Jeremy is absolutely ridiculous. While he is given more to do in this book than he normally was in this show, the roles of the cast were still divided fairly, with each of the original members contributing to the cause. Yumi and Ulrich go to Brussels and discover the first city. Aelita discovers the mirror. Odd helps to formulate the plans for defending the school, and so on and so forth. Everyone has a major role to play, and the author being Jeremy is meant more in a tongue-in-cheek way, in my opinion, because all 4 books are written in the third person, with several scenes, like the ones with Ditto in her office, being pieces of information that Jeremy would be incapable of knowing. And in regards to that prologue, I have my own interpretation of it. The line they're referring to is when Jeremy says, "Not one day has passed when I have not thought of you, Aelita, and goodness knows if you're still listening." One of the people from the poll was also confused by this, so this works out. As we learned at the end of Book 4, Aelita's amnesia issue was due to the excess of information in her brain. While they did remove it with the memory-snatching device, Jerry was likely worried that she might still lose her memory again, so he made a record of everything that happened, similar to what the gang did in Book 1, so that she may be reminded of what happened. Since Jeremy has no idea when her memory might fail again, if at all, there is no telling where Aelita will be or who she'll be with. With that in mind, the first quote is worded the way it is because Jeremy doesn't know if he'll be around to remind her of how close they are, and the second line is likely referring to the fact that she might have stopped reading/watching this diary just as she started the prologue, since it would just seem like unrelated nonsense to an amnesiac. To further support my interpretation, the pictures for the Book 1 show a package from Jeremy to Aelita, with stuff like the video diary from book 1, her pendant, and other things to remind her of her friends. It also contains notes that say things along the lines of, "The bridge at the factory. You can't have forgotten it, Aelita." All of this clearly indicates Jeremy being worried about Aelita's memory. Now, before moving on, I would like to point out that I have nothing against the reviewer Really Salty Peppers. Their review is just the most in-depth negative opinion of Chronicles I've ever seen, and it really helped to provide a different perspective on the series. Overall, I think the main issue that Chronicles suffers from is that there wasn't enough time or space to flesh out the story it wanted to tell. I don't know specifically what it was, but the consistency in the page numbers leads me to believe that there was some sort of variable like money that delegated how much of the story David and Pier Domenico could tell. If the length of the books were doubled, there would be plenty of time to give William a character arc and something to do, time to delve into Margot's backstory, time to more organically redeem Xana. It's a shame to think about what could have been. However, I've dwelled on the negatives for far too long, so let's talk about where the story succeeds. The most obvious one is that every major question mentioned at the beginning of this video is answered. Every single one. While you may not like some of the answers given, at least this sequel actually bothers to resolve the lingering plot threads of the original show. The conclusion, while muddied by Xana's revival, is still very conclusive as everything from the original show has been resolved. Yumi and Ulrich have finally admitted that they're more than friends and are ready to move forward with their relationship. Odd has finally found a girl that he actually wants to really commit to, and most importantly, Aelita has been reunited with her mother after several decades of separation. It's all incredibly heartwarming, even if Eva didn't have much to do aside from being Xana's puppet for most of the series. And while I already praised the dialogue at the start of the Chronicles section, I want to give special mention to some of my favorite scenes. The scene where Ulrich learns his father was a traitor to Waldo goes from being incredibly tense as his hatred has reached fever pitch, to touching as he realizes that his father has been racked with guilt for 10 years over something he couldn't even remember that he did, and that it must have been a heavy burden on his heart. In the scene between the two in the dorms where Ulrich finally accepts his father's offer to atone is a nice cherry on top. And perhaps my favorite scene was the final chapter of Book 3 with Odd and Yumi huddled around a small candle under a blanket to keep warm. Things were really looking bleak with the Green Phoenix, the Men in Black, everyone being divided, and Xana's return that Yumi has started to lose hope. But Odd, ever the optimist, is right there to give her encouragement and reassures her that it's all going to work out in the end. In particular, this line hit me hard. We still have a lot of mysteries to solve, but I'm sure that we'll soon find a way to reunite the group. We'll get the bad guys and we'll make everything go back to normal. We're the Lyoko warriors after all. Our mission has always been to save the world, right? If you've seen the show, that second to last line may have stuck out to you, as it is very similar to a line Yumi said back in part 2 of the prologue.
It's risky, but I think we should. After all, we are Lyoko warriors, aren't we?
This similarity to me is a clear sign that the author was directly referencing this moment. Yumi having her own words said back to her by a close friend to give her hope creates a wonderful through line from the beginning all the way up to that point and carries a lot of emotional weight to it. I can't exactly say why, but perhaps it's because it made me reflect on how crazy of a journey they've been on, and the emotions came flooding in all at once. In summary, Code Lyoko Chronicles, though it suffers from some major retcon issues at the start, nearly every single one of them can be completely ignored. And while there are many times where it felt like the story was rushed, it does still have its moments. It also answers all of the major lingering questions, as well as a few minor ones, while also tying up several narrative loose ends to create an ending that feels conclusive, if not entirely satisfactory. Looking at the poll, there isn't a lot of conclusive information I could gather. As I expected, a lot of them hadn't read Chronicles and couldn't provide an opinion, and some of the ones who didn't speak English primarily, which made it difficult to understand what they were trying to say. Of the few who had read part or all of Chronicles, most of them said they enjoyed it, one said that they had mixed feelings on it, and one despised it so much that they claimed that they could write a fanfiction better than it. Their thoughts on the ending reflected these statements as well. Alright, let's end this. Let's wrap it all up. Man, what a journey. Over 16,200 words, 38 pages, plus a few extras for that non-scripted addendum I did earlier on in the evolution section, as well as a year and 7 months worth of waiting. The script was written and last modified on June 26th of 2020. And my lines, the original ones, were last recorded on July 19th of that year. It's been a long time. I'll get into that in the outro. For now, wrap up. Now that I've given my thoughts on both of the different sequels, I can sum up how I feel in comparing the two together. Now, just seeing how I talked about the two, it should be pretty obvious that, yeah, I prefer Chronicles over Evolution. And looking at the poll, that sentiment is fairly mutual. It's not the most accurate results, though, because a lot of people have not read Chronicles, and a lot of them didn't know about its fan translation, so there's a lot of non-responses. 5 said that they preferred Chronicles over Evolution, while 2 said that they preferred Evolution over Chronicles. But one of those Evolution people said that they hadn't read Chronicles, so that answer doesn't really matter because they don't actually have an opinion on Chronicles to give. So really in this poll, 1 out of 6 liked Evolution more. Evolution fails to capture the spirit of Code Lyoko despite being a more direct sequel. A lot of that has to do with its short production time and its suspected low budget. And this isn't helped by the fact that it has a very inconclusive ending as well. Chronicles, while basically a completely different genre from the original show, and even having more retcons than Evolution, is often more loved, or at the very least, more tolerated than Evolution, because it embodies the heart of Code Lyoko more than the former. The retcons are pretty bad, yes, but because 99% of them don't matter and can be completely ignored, it's kind of hard for me to hate the books, at least for that specific aspect. And I think more importantly is that the books actually gave an ending, and they wrapped it all up. With all of that said, I can say with 100% confidence that I would prefer Code Lyoko Chronicles to be the true canonical sequel over Code Lyoko Evolution. And that's where I plan to end this video initially. However, something's kind of nagging at me. My thoughts on Chronicles and the series as a whole have really shifted ever since I finished my rewatch and reread of the series. Back when I was doing my rewatch of the original show, I had taken a few months break right before the ending, so when I came back, a lot of my dissatisfaction with the ending and how a lot of stuff wasn't answered had actually just faded away. I had expected to finish it feeling disappointed, but instead I was just satisfied. When viewed in isolation from some of the other series problems, it honestly works really well as a finale. And for a while now, I've been wondering if the show actually truly did need a sequel at all. But the strangest change came with my perspective on the books. I had first read Chronicles shortly after the fan translation had finished back in 2014 in my junior year of high school. So roughly 6 years had passed from that point to the point where I did my reread in 2020. I still remembered the main plot elements, of course, but a lot of the minor stuff, like the massive recons that Book 1 did, I didn't remember at all. And if you had asked me before I did my reread what my favorite book series was, I would have said Chronicles. But after doing my reread and looking at it more critically and not being distracted by all the plot twists and whatnot that I had experienced for the first time, I can say it's not very good, and it's definitely not my favorite book series anymore. They are very flawed. They're rushed. They retconned even more than Evolution did, and while it was unavoidable since it is a book and not a show, it is still ultimately less fun to read this than it is to watch it play out the way that the show always did back in the original. I'm incredibly grateful to David and Pier Domenico for giving me this book series and answering these questions that I'd yearned for so long. But I still wish for a better sequel. Chronicles just doesn't satisfy me the way that it did when I first read it. And while that is kinda to be expected since your first viewing or reading of anything is always going to be unique, when I revisit other series that I love, the difference is never this staggering, and sometimes I even actually love it more the second time and the third and the fourth more than I did the first. Maybe the stress of doing this for a video had affected my enjoyment of the book series, and that's definitely possible, But I think the main reason for my lack of enjoyment this time, or at least relative to how much I enjoyed it the first time, is that it's just not as good as I remember it. And with evolution being evolution, I think I'm just going to stick with the original show's ending anytime I rewatch the series in the future. That being said, as I just said a little while ago, I would still love to have a sequel. One that is well-paced, really detailed, faithful to the original, and answers all the questions I have ever had. But I just don't think it's ever going to happen. I mean, it could. It's just really, really unlikely. If Chronicles was adapted into a show, I think it could actually do fairly well. Especially since you could, one, cut out all the recap stuff because you don't need it anymore. You have the show legally available on their official YouTube channel, so you don't need a recap anymore. So you can remove all those retcons and stuff. And you can also pace out the story in a much better way to give characters like Hannibal Mago and Xana's redemption arc a lot more care and, give William an actual character arc and something to do in the story. That would be fantastic. And for the whole Xana survival thing, either they need to rewrite how that survival is and just have it be the full-blown Xana, or, and I think this is my preferred option, just have his sacrifice be permanent, because that is, in my opinion, way more impactful and leads to a much better story. But as I said, it's so incredibly unlikely that I honestly don't really want to hold out too much hope, because I'll just be disappointed. The two sequels we've gotten so far in Code Lyoko's history have not been ideal. I talked very positively about Chronicles in the video, but you gotta be honest, it really isn't that great. And I'm pretty sure I was more positive about it than I would have been if I had just read it separately and not immediately after Evolution, which left such a bad taste in my mouth, because then my brain's comparing, well, yeah, this isn't the greatest writing you've ever read before, but compared to this, it's amazing. Now, Sophie de Croisette has stated that she would actually be interested in doing a movie that takes place before the ending of Season 4, just to have another adventure. And that movie could be the chance to answer some of those questions. Now, I'm sure I wouldn't be able to do all of them, especially since, it's just one movie. You couldn't cram it all in and have it still be satisfactory. But there is an opportunity there and an interest from the creator. So there's a small chance. The main thing in the way of this potential movie idea or even a brand new sequel happening is that, well, the company who owns it have to actually decide that it's monetarily worth it to do it. And then two, if we do get it, will it even be good? Will people who know Code Lyoko, like Sophie, who helped create it, be given the rights to make this stuff, or will it be given to someone else? And will we just get another Evolution or Chronicles on our hands? Now, this video has kind of gone in a different direction than I expected it to. Initially, I thought it would be just a comparison between Chronicles and Evolution and how Chronicles is just a lot better. But now it's kind of ended up being well, Chronicles is better, but neither one of them is really good as a sequel, and honestly, I'm just not going to probably read or watch either of those anymore. Now, some fans are actually making their own sequels to the series. The one that I am most interested in is Project Eradication, which is going to be a sequel to Evolution. And that is something that's going to be very interesting to see, and how the fans are going to do it. But it still does kind of suck that it's just a fan fiction. Now you might be saying, well, why does that matter? If Project Eradication ends up being really good, you can just count it as your own headcanon and make it the actual canon sequel, at least in your own mind. And yeah, I could, but that's not really satisfying. If that's all we need to do to be satisfied by a story, we would watch a show for maybe a few episodes to get the plot and kind of general idea of the universe, then stop watching and make our own ending and then never watch the other one again. The reason we don't do that is because we are interested in how they tell the story. It is their creation, and we want to know how they will tell it, what scenarios they will put the characters in, and where the story will go based on their design. That's why we watch the show. That's why we continue to watch it and why we care to this day. Having fans tell their own version, while it could be fun and very interesting and well done, it's not Sophie de Croisette's sequel. It's not Jerome Mascadet's sequel. It's this other person's sequel, and that's just not what I, and I'm sure many fans, were looking for. And that's not to disparage the fan works again. Like, I'm interested and I'm going to be watching it. I will look forward to its release. I've been waiting for its release for a long time now. But yeah, that's just kind of how it is. So what if this is it? What if we never get another sequel for Code Lyoko? Or if we do, it's just as bad, if not worse, than Evolution and Chronicles. Well, if that happens, I think it's important for both me and all Code Lyoko fans to remember that the original show will always be there for us. And it can be viewed in isolation. We don't have to worry about what came after, because Code Lyoko the show is just there, on its own, written by its own specific writers. Everything else that happened after it was not involving the original team. So no matter how bad Chronicles or Evolution is, or how bad a potential sequel could be, the original show will always be there for us to enjoy, and no sequel, no matter how bad, can take that away from us. It's finally done. I honestly can't believe it. I have worked on this video not necessarily for that entire year and 7 months. There's been a lot of procrastination and but also a lot of things happening in my life. A lot of changes, as you can see from my setup here. I moved to an apartment in this time period. I even have a new mic and stuff and a better place to record. I just did it in this room with this old mic just for the sake of some sort of auditory consistency for the whole video. This video has been weighing on my mind for so long, mostly because it's like, hey, you started this project and it's been so long, why don't you finish it? But even beyond that, it's like, I promised a lot of people I would do it. Like, I polled people for this. People were waiting for this video, and I made them wait so dang long, and I am so sorry to anybody who has been waiting and did not choose to forget me and have actually been patiently waiting for me. I am so sorry. To my YouTube subscribers, I'm also sorry for how few my uploads have been. Again, part of it is justifiable in that I've been super busy and sometimes, but other times I procrastinate. And like, I have a whole lot of ideas I want to do, I just need to sit down and do them. I guess another thing I want to say maybe is like, if on the off chance that some of the people who worked on like Chronicles and Evolution are somehow watching this, which I don't think is going to happen, but in case any of them are watching this, I just want to say that I have no ill will towards you, and I honestly hope you have been doing fantastic since then. None of my criticisms were meant to be personal, and I genuinely hope you've been doing fantastic since Evolution. Heck, I've seen some of you even moved into doing directing work, and I hope you've been doing really well and that you continue to improve in the years to come. Genuinely. I hope you have nothing but wonderful luck. And for those of you who left the industry, I hope you're doing well in whatever you're doing now. Like, as upset as Evolution made me, I am not holding it against the actual individuals who made it. Everyone tried their hardest. It didn't turn out great, but them's the breaks. I'm not going to hold it against y'all. With that, I think I need to just wrap this up. I gotta upload this part of the video into it, edit it, chop it up, make it all nice and condensed, and then put some reference footage over some parts of it. I hope you have a fantastic year, and if you're going to stick around, I look forward to seeing you again in my next video.